Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy. Welcome to One to One. A cornerstone of Donald Trump's presidential campaign was his promise to round up and deport millions of undocumented immigrants. He seems to be following through on that promise. As of last summer, 60,000 immigrants were languishing in ICE detention, up from about 40,000 when Trump took office and 7,000 20 years ago, according to the New York Times. The administration has announced plans to increase ICE's detention capacity to 100,000. Supporters of increasing immigrant detention say it's the proper response to crimes committed by undocumented immigrants, to the financial drain they allegedly put on public resources, and that it deters illegal immigration. In her new book with co-author Nancy Heemstra, Deirdre Conlon argues that the driving force behind immigration detention is profits. In Immigration Detention, Inc., the big business of locking up immigrants, they offer proof that private companies and local governments are reaping huge financial benefits by locking immigrants up. Welcome.
Thank you.
Almost every day, we are hearing news reports of roundups of immigrants. They're being rounded up at warehouses, at construction sites, at public demonstrations, even at courthouses where they are showing up to plead their cases. Mm-hmm. Where is ICE taking them?
ICE is taking all of these immigrants to the already massive immigration detention system. So the United States has and has had for many years the largest immigration detention system in the world. And that has just been scaled up since the current administration has been in power. There are approximately, that we know of, 160 immigration detention facilities dotted around the country. So we tend to think about immigration as a border issue, but one of the things that in our book, Nancy and myself demonstrate is that immigration detention and immigration enforcement is actually a nationwide issue, with immigrants housed in detention facilities, often in remote locations, in states across the United States.
And taxpayers are paying something like $3.4 billion a year?
That's right. The budget for immigration detention in 2024 was $3.4 billion of taxpayer money. Now that budget has just increased 3 times with passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill in the summer of this year. So spending on detention for this year is going to be about $14 billion, which is one of the reasons how and why the detention system is going to grow and continue to grow to the numbers that Donald Trump says he's going to detain 100,000 immigrants.
Why is immigration detention booming right now?
Well, immigration detention has been on the rise for quite a considerable length of time.
And under a number of presidents, right?
That's
both Democratic and Republican.
That is absolutely correct. So one of the things that we really try to get across in our book is that this is not just a Republican or a Democrat issue, right? It runs across both parties in the country, and has the support of politicians, in both parties. What we have seen is that support for immigration detention has been, part of the legislation for many, many years, and that continues to grow. And part of the reason that there has been support for legislation that is very harsh on immigrants and amping up immigration enforcement has to do with the lobby and the campaign donations that companies like Geo Group and CoreCivic, which are 2 of the big actors in the immigration detention system, contribute to the political lobby and to the sort of legislative process around immigration detention.
In other words, the push to detain, to round up more immigrants comes from the companies that run immigration detention centers,
Correct.
Facilities. Now, You note in your book that the detention and the removal of certain groups in the United States is nothing new, that we've been doing this for a long time, moving the Native Americans off of their native grounds, the incarceration of unemployed black men in the South, and they're locked up first and then put on these contract gangs where they labored for nothing. Chinese immigrants, certainly the Japanese Americans during World War II got rounded up and put in internment camps. And I even understand there was a mass deportation of Mexicans at one point.
That's correct,
Okay.
yes.
And so this big acceleration under Donald Trump and the profit that it brings to private companies. I mean, the Trump factions have a tendency to monetize all of their policies. Their policies are about making some people rich, wealthy. Do you agree that this is part of what's going on?
It's certainly what is part of what's going on. And I think that what we're seeing currently is an amping up of that monetization. At the same time, and again, part of what we're really keen to get across in the research that Nancy and I have been doing for over a decade now, is that this is a process, as you said, Sheryl, that isn't new. So, starting in the 1990s, as you noted kind of at the outset today, we had a situation where immigration detention was, while it has been around for decades, if not the best part of a century in the United States, where the numbers of people detained was relatively small. So in 1994, there were 7,000 people in immigration detention, right? But what we saw is that as changes in legislation started to be introduced, and as the same companies that were involved in the growth of the carceral system, the incarceration system, where minorities have been locked up for years, the same companies that are involved in that process saw immigration detention as a kind of a growth opportunity. And it is on that basis that we started to see the rise of the use of immigration detention.
You say there's a whole web of interest, private and public, that sustains and increasing immigration detention. Describe that web
Sure.
for me.
So many people will now be familiar with corporations like Geo Group and CoreCivic, and they certainly stand to gain and have been gaining significant amounts of revenue from immigration detention. So even before the current administration, between 30 and 44% of Geo Group and CoreCivic's revenue came from contracts with ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the federal authority that oversees and implements immigration enforcement in the country. What we know now is that it is not just ICE, our CoreCivic and Geo Group that are benefiting from immigration detention. It is many other entities that provide services such as food in immigration detention, medical care, or what counts as medical care in the system. If detainees want to make a phone call to a loved one or kind of a support network that they have, then that is also monetized through contracts and subcontracts with private service providers. So every single service that is provided in immigration detention is through subcontracts, and they are part of this web of dependency. But it doesn't stop there. Local governments who are contracted with ICE in order to provide jail space to house immigration detainees also generate income not only from the federal government but also through the subcontracting process. So they bring in revenue that in theory helps to offset things like taxation to residents, or that helps to pay for municipal services like playgrounds and schools and hospitals in local communities.
How do they get the money? Do they just sort of get from the companies that have the contracts?
Yes, that's certainly one of the ways. So for instance, one of the services that we look at in our research is commissaries. And I can say a lot more about the commissary system and why it is so lucrative for these immigration detention contractors. But as part of the contracting processes, what commissary bids and contracts must put in place is that they will pay a commission to the local government where they are providing service in an immigration detention facility. Now, in some of the facilities that we have looked at, the facilities that we look at are primarily in the northeast of the United States, in New Jersey and New York, but the same companies are involved in the system across the country. What we find is that the commission rates, or the kickbacks as you describe them, are between 15% and 40% on the sales that are made in the commissary. So that's not an insignificant amount of money that goes to local governments, as well as the money that local governments are getting from their contracts with the federal government, with ICE.
So there's also a tie to elected officials. I mean, I assume the companies that you mentioned have a huge lobbying arm, correct?
That's right.
And they lobby the politicians, and I assume contribute money to the politicians' campaigns?
That's right. So politicians at all levels, at state and federal level, have been reaping benefit from these corporations, Geo Group and CoreCivic in particular. In the 2023 election cycle, CoreCivic and Geo Group contributed about $3 million between them to campaign contributions. And part of the rationale for doing that was, of course, so that those elected officials would support legislation that would both criminalize migrants and help to expand the immigration detention system.
And so they do.
That's exactly right. So they do, yes.
I was shocked to learn that the overwhelming majority, I've forgotten what the actual percentage is, of immigrants in detention are in privately run facilities. What is that percentage again?
It's 90% of the system.
That's amazing.
It is astounding. You know, that has grown over the time frame that Nancy and I have been doing the research that we have been doing. When we started doing our research, you know, over a decade ago, it stood at around 65%. So the private sector has always been a significant kind of player in the immigration detention system. But as you say, you know, it's grown quite significantly and quite quickly. But to talk about these webs of dependency, I think that it's really important for us to understand that if we locate kind of blame or responsibility only on the private sector, then we're missing part of the point, which is that government and the private sector are, you know, in lockstep with one another in supporting this kind of these kind of moves and this move to expand the immigration detention system.
Now, the purpose of immigrant detention is supposed to be to basically to hold the immigrants while they can have proper hearings, due process.
Right.
But you've said that that's not the primary goal of the system as it is now.
That's right, yes. You know, one of the important things to note about immigration regulations in general is that somebody who falls afoul of immigration regulations is considered to have a civil violation, or it's a civil matter, not a criminal matter. And the use of immigration detention is really to facilitate an administrative process. It is not, or wasn't originally intended to be a criminal matter or a punitive process. But as successive legislation has been passed, as we have seen things like aggravated felony regulations as part of the immigration regulations that we have in this country, what we're seeing is that people more and more associate migrants with acts of criminality. And it's very difficult to undo those kinds of associations once they have become established. But the truth is that immigration detention is intended to be something that helps to facilitate a bureaucratic process. Now, over time, what we've seen is that immigration detention, and this is certainly true of the current administration, it's believed that it serves a deterrent purpose. So by amping up the number of people who are detained, by amping up the threat of detention for migrants across the country, the belief is that it will deter people from trying to cross the border or from kind of taking roles in society.
But has that been confirmed? That
there is very little evidence that that either detention or deportation actually serves a deterrent effect. And in fact, prior to the current system that we have, prior to the 1990s, what we saw is that migrants who were in violation of their immigration status would show up for their immigration hearings. They're trying to do the right thing, and therefore they don't want to fall afoul of kind of processes that are put in place to try to regulate their status or to understand what their status is in the country. And so there is compliance by migrants, and therefore immigration detention is really an unnecessary administrative process.
I was really horrified by the conditions in these detention facilities as you describe them, and one concerns food. Tell us about what it's like.
One of the things that we have done in our research is we have gotten hold of myriad documents from the contracts themselves to daily schedules in immigration detention to try to understand what conditions are actually like, because getting into immigration detention is extremely difficult, and even more so in the current moment. And one of the things that we have been able to look at is inspection reports. So all immigration detention facilities are required by law to have an inspections process. Now that is also a faulty process for a number of reasons, not least the fact that it is also monetized. But when we look at inspection reports, what we find is that about a third of the complaints that immigration detainees make is around the food that they receive. So the food they receive in both quality of food and quantity of food is abysmal. We have reports upon reports, actually, across the country that highlight spoiled food being served to immigration detainees, quantities of food that are essentially kind of low-calorie diets, or kind of not the kind of diets that one would expect of a regular adult. And so there was a study done by the Centers for Disease Control back in 2017 that indicated that people who are in carceral facilities, whether immigration detention or prisons, are 6.4 times more likely than people outside of the system to have a foodborne illness, which gives you some indication of just how poor the food is.
And also, they're just hungry.
That's right. They're chronically hungry. Again, some of the reasons for that, from picking apart the contracts as we do in our research, one of the other reasons for that is that there are lengthy periods of time between meals. It's stipulated that there shouldn't be a gap of more than 14 hours between meals in immigration detention. And the contractors stretch that to the limit so that people, wait for very long periods of time and are therefore hungry. And when they are hungry and don't get enough to eat, one of the things that they do is they turn to commissary to try to sustain levels of nutrition, if not nutrition, at least energy.
You also talk about coerced labor of the detained immigrants.
That's right. So this is a cycle, another cycle that we describe in the book. So a detained migrant who's hungry, for whom medical care is poor, if not unavailable to them, will turn to a commissary, turn to the store in the facility in order to try to supplement what they're receiving, to have at least some semblance of a decent quality of life, if one could even characterize it as that. At commissaries, migrants are charged between 4 and 7 times more for products that, the same product that they would buy outside of immigration detention. So just to break that down, one of the things that we talk about in the book is that a portion-sized can of tuna fish in the Goshen facility, a jail facility in upstate New York, costs $2.85. The same portion-sized can of tuna is $1 outside of immigration detention. Now, a question becomes, how do immigrant detainees pay for these kinds of things at commissaries? And some may have members of family or networks who contribute to a commissary account on their behalf. Many end up doing what's referred to as voluntary work programs, or participating in voluntary work programs.
What kind of work are we talking about?
They're doing work that is essential to the maintenance and running of a facility. So they'll work in food services, they'll work in the laundry, they'll work in the library, they'll work doing barbering in the detention center that they are based in. And for the work that they do, for an 8-hour work day in detention, a migrant earns $1 per day. And with that $1 per day, they might turn to the commissary, where it will take them 3 days of labor in order to be able to afford that can of tuna.
I did not know about, the horrors, the conditions in these detention facilities, and I did not know about all of the companies who are making a whole lot of money off of it, and the local public entities that are, paying for our transportation or whatever else they're using it to pay for. Why don't people know about this?
That's a great question. I mean, what we have found in our research is that, as I said, it's difficult to get into immigration detention facilities, so a lot is hidden. When it comes to getting hold of documents that would help to reveal the kind of information that we've been able to put together in this book, a lot of the information that's requested is actually redacted, right? So it's redacted because it's considered commercially sensitive or to be potentially expose issues around national security. So that's one of the reasons why a lot of this information is actually not well known. What companies are trying to do is to keep what they're doing and the revenue that they're making from immigration detention under wraps.
We're not going to have time to talk much about the medical condition, the medical care, but I assume that is as awful as the food provisions.
It is. It's a repeat of the same kind of a disturbing narrative. When it comes to the contracting process, one of the things that we have traced is that lawsuits have become a weapon by which facilities or contractors rather guarantee that the lowest cost of doing business is what is provided in immigration detention facilities. So in all of the facilities that we have investigated and across the country, what we see is that if the lowest bidder for a medical services contract does not win the contract, they will take the local county executive or entity that is contracting them to court in order to get the contract. So it disincentivizes decent medical care.
The company that gets the food contract might pay only $1.28 per meal.
That's right. That's right.
And you can't provide nutritious food, nutritious diet for that amount.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And it is always the lowest bidder
who wins.
Who wins, whether it's the food contract or the medical contract.
Now that we know about this, what can we, members of the public, do to push back against this, to say that, this is terrible, we don't want you doing that, you should not have these big companies basically making profits on the back of these immigrants. What can we do?
It's a great question, and one that we get a lot at the moment, for sure. I think chief in terms of what people can do is to work to ensure that the profit motive in immigration detention gets dismantled. So how can people do that? First of all, through divestment campaigns and lobbies to boycott companies that are involved in immigration detention. So there are food service providers that we are all, or many of us are familiar with, like Aramark, for instance, who provide food services on college campuses around the country, that are also involved as food service providers in immigration detention facilities. There have been some successful campaigns. For example, in New York State, the pension funds divested from investments in Geo Group and Core Civic. So we have seen some success around divestment campaigns.
Geo Group, Core Civic, give me the names of a few other companies that we should be.
Well, the main medical service provider in the facilities that we have looked at is a company called WellPath. So that's one to watch out for. A number of the other companies are Trinity Services, which also provides food service and commissaries. The big commissary provider in the facilities that we look at is a company called Keefe Commissary Network. One of the things that I want to highlight and that we do in the book is that many of these companies are affiliated with other companies and part of parent companies and part of private equity firms. So it doesn't necessarily always have to be the company that's directly involved in contracts with an immigration detention facility. There are other ways that that these private equity firms and parent companies and large corporations can be targeted as part of a campaign against the profit-making motive in immigration detention.
And I'm sure you talk about, mention a number of those in your book.
That's right.
I am so glad that you wrote this book. I learned so many things that I didn't know about the immigration detention system, and I was horrified by it. And I think, I hope that as a result of what you have exposed, that more people will talk about it, make noise about it. I'm afraid we're out of time. I'd like to thank Deirdre Conlon, co-author with Nancy Heemstra of Immigration Detention, Inc., The Big Business of Locking Up Migrants, for joining me today. To learn about our upcoming shows, you can follow us on Instagram at 121 CUNY TV. And you can watch the show on the go by downloading the CUNY TV app. For 121 and CUNY TV, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.